enjoyed being on the stage. I'm a true Leo. And I'm worried about how are people going to react to my presentations. I made every effort to get the facts together, and I worried what the response would be. And I learned pretty quickly the response was very good. And because partly I had the facts at hand when somebody asked me a question. And I've only had 11 hecklers, 2 of whom were drunk, and over 700 lectures. And that, I've covered not the world, but, I've spoken in all 50 states and 9 provinces and now 17 other countries. So I've had a pretty good sampling out there. And what I found was people that I respected responded very well. That's what got me rolling, really. Engineering Society of Detroit was sold out 3 weeks in advance for 1,008 people for my lecture, and there wasn't one nasty question. And a whole bunch of other groups, Los Alamos, the American Nuclear Society section there brought me in. And we had over 500 people. Again, no negativity.
Sorry to interrupt you here. Did you ever concern yourself that because of your work with classified material, that those in charge would try to stop you from speaking out or from doing further investigations?
Well, yes. When I was at Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab working on nuclear rockets, when I kept doing local talks, and then I got more and more talks, and I finally went to management, and I raised that question. I said, look, I enjoy giving lectures, but I have a wife, a child, a mortgage, a job, a security clearances. I don't want to lose any of these things. So I need a reading from the company on what I can or can't do. And frankly, if they had said, look, you can't say anything more about this, you lose your job, I would have stopped. I mean, family comes first and all this stuff. So they come back to me a few days later. My boss says, hey, I don't decide those things. He booted it up to management. They came back to me. They said, there are 3 things, Stan. First, you can identify yourself as a Westinghouse nuclear physicist. Second, you can say what you please on your time. Third, we want you to start off with a statement, a disclaimer, if you will, that the views you're about to hear are mine and mine alone and not those of my employer. Now, who could ask for anything more? Well, I did ask for something more. I didn't really, but when Los Alamos called me about speaking there, they said, would you like to speak? It was a guy I knew that I worked with. He was at Los Alamos working on nuclear rockets, and I was at Westinghouse. He said, on an expense account, Stan. I said, well, I don't make those decisions. I'm in Pittsburgh. He's in New Mexico. So I go to management, and they said, yes, I traveled there on an expense account for the explicit purpose of giving a lecture, Flying Saucers Are Real, to the Los Alamos section of the American Nuclear Society. Now, admittedly, Westinghouse is a corporate member of the Nuclear Society. I'm a member of the Nuclear Society. So, it wasn't really out in left field particularly. And they did the same thing for an Institute of Electrical Electronic Engineers, sent me on an expense account. Now, this wasn't implying that they were believers in flying saucers, but some management had heard me give a very well-attended talk in Pittsburgh. I recognized my boss 3 levels up, And so they knew I wasn't an unknown quantity, and I was on the radio quite a bit and some television. And so they weren't flying blind. So I worried about that. But the response was really good. And what can I say? They indulged me, whatever you want to call it, but I've talked with thousands of engineers and scientists. And but get back to your original question, I found that if I stuck to the facts and didn't enlarge and didn't speculate in ways that didn't make sense, people would respond extremely well. The industrial guys know, of course, about security. Most of the people I talk to, they know that secrets can be kept. In other words, I'm in the industrial world, not the academic world. And it's one of the things that bothers me. So many of the academics seem to have no understanding that there's a large entire world out there in industry and the national labs of people doing very advanced research and development, much of it classified, and whose job is not to publish or perish. I've had 2 different people tell me, and it still bugs me, They say if Roswell had happened, Stan, they'd have had to take half the scientists in the country away from academia to work on that. And I said, you got to be kidding. We've got this huge group of people. Los Alamos had 8,000 employees. Sandia had that many. Lawrence Livermore. And there's Oak Ridge and Hanford and, Lockheed and GE and all the rest. All kinds of people with very high skills, very good equipment. That was a nice thing about working on these programs. You got the best stuff. And who didn't have to publish or perish. They wrote technical reports, most of which were classified. I know. I still don't have a copy of all the reports that I wrote. So there's a real world. Well, let me give you a sample. When I worked on the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department of General Electric in Cincinnati, in 1958, we employed 3,500 people, 1,100 of whom were engineers and scientists. Our budget that year was $100 million, and that was a lot of money in 1958. Now, it may be considered chump change now, a billion here, a billion there, but that was a big program. It wasn't 6 professors and 12 grad students. And so the real world has put me in a position where I'm able to evaluate how people respond. I do a lot of classroom visits when I'm on campuses. And I once figured out I'd answered over 50,000 questions between radio and television.
I saw that in the book. That's exhaustive. Well, I'm tired just thinking of it.
Well, and what I'm saying is I've heard most of the questions before.
Like, can we talk about one of them?
Sure.
I want to take the one that has to do with, we can't get there from here.
That's one that particularly infuriates me.
It's wild, as if we would have the technology in the current NASA setup to do that.
Well, yeah, and the kicker is there's a whole lot of literature, scientific literature. I mean, I was working on nuclear fusion propulsion systems way back in 1961 at Aerojet General Nucleonics. And the head of the program was a guy who'd been head of the fusion development work at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Gave papers at international meetings. The kicker is that we're stuck with the old views without checking the new ones. I do classroom visits from time to time, and I do seminars, colloquium for physics departments and stuff like that. And a little scenario here. I say, what's the numerical value of 1g, the acceleration of gravity at the surface of the Earth? And they all immediately say 9.8 meters per second squared. And I say, okay, how do you put that in terms that's meaningful to anybody, like compared to Corvettes? They look at me like I'm talking Swahili. I ask them the speed of light. They quote a number, 300,000 kilometers per second. I say, we don't measure anything else like that. That's 670 million miles an hour. Now, the real question is, how long does it take at 1G to get to the speed of light? Multiple choice. 1,000 years, 100 years, 10 years, 1 year. You'd be amazed at how many professors and students think it's 1,000 years or 100 years or 10 years. It's really only 1. And so they don't have their facts straight. They don't know anything about the real world because they can't conceive that, people would be looking at this kind of stuff. And the head of the Hayden Planetarium talked about our fastest rocket, the Voyager spacecraft, would take 70,000 years to get to the nearest star. And they don't bother to say it has no propulsion system on it. It hasn't since it left the Earth. It's like saying that if you throw a bottle in the ocean, that tells you how fast you can cross the ocean. It's coasting. Totally irrelevant. And so they won't dig into this stuff. And I worked on fission nuclear rockets. Now, they're impressive because, Los Alamos' biggest one, 4,400 megawatts, less than 7 feet in diameter. That's twice the power of Grand Coulee Dam, which is a little larger than 7 feet in diameter. That was operated successfully in the 60s, mind you. They are totally unaware of the nuclear propulsion work. They may have heard of nuclear submarines, but how many people know that the Navy, and it's not just the United States Navy, has built aircraft carriers that can operate, nuclear-powered ones, that can operate for 18 years without refueling? And a little collection of data over a 10-year period to show the kind of progress we've made.